Greetings and bienvenue, Midnight Crew. Thank you for returning to this broadcast. And welcome to new viewers joining us for the first time. If you like a video, then feel free to subscribe.
The Australian Yowie. Any Aussies here on /x/ had any experiences with Yowies out in the bush? Spoken to a few who always grew up being taught not to muck around in the bush, especially at night. Plenty of sightings, especially around the Pilliga and Gold, Sunshine Coast hinterland. Thoughts?
Haven't seen a good thread about this in some time. I have a heap of old saved stuff from a few years back on an old hard drive I'll try and get a hold of. But in the meantime, feel free to dump screen grabs and your own stories and shit. I'll share 2 of my own suspected experiences in this thread. Australian, so Yowie story time. Story 1, which actually happened after story 2, but I'll post it first because it's much shorter. Out on a rural property near the town of Apsley, Victoria, with 2 of my mates and some of their family. It's an old sheep farm, but borders a lot of native forest. There are also heaps of little creeks and dams nearby. We are out one night, by a campfire and a half-oiled drum in the middle of a dusty paddock by an old disused sheep shearing shed. We are sitting around chatting, watching the stars, usual camping shit. We are chatting away and suddenly we hear some odd sounds from near the shearing shed, by an old dam. There is a line of trees and an old dry creek bed near the dam, and we couldn't tell if the sound was coming from in the trees at ground level or from in the creek bed. It was pitch black and we couldn't see it either. At first we just joked around saying it's a possum or a koala, which makes some pretty scary sounds in their own right, but it sounded bigger. We start to feel a little off, so being young fellas, we were trying to be all macho and hide our fear. We started making sounds back at whatever it was. It's hard to describe what the sound was. The best I can describe it is a deep howl mixed with a bark. It didn't last very long but had the low notes that a howl would have and ended sharply like a bark. We start to feel a little better, so I make a mock growl-like sound back at it. Whatever the fuck it was repeats the exact same sound I made right back at us. It was surreal. We didn't know how to react. Then it did it again, and again, each time with a little variation. After that, we packed up our shit and headed back towards our cars. No one else said they heard anything odd, but everyone else who was there was sleeping in an old farmhouse a fair distance away near the front of the property. Still freaks me out to this day. Pick-related is the kind of tree cover you get out in the area where this happened. I think this happened in 2015 or 16, not quite sure. I've got another story and it's far longer, which happened in 2013 or 14, I believe. I'll write it up and post it when done.
I guess I have an anecdote. One of my uncles is deathly afraid of Sasquatch. Him and his 2 brothers and 2 sisters, Mom and Dad went camping in Minnesota in like the early 80s, and in the middle of the night, he just started screaming and woke everyone up. He said one was trying to open his tent. No one else saw or heard anything, and they chalked it up to a nightmare. But he still refuses to stay out at night in any forest to this day.
Here's the other story. Be me camping with 2 buddies in rural Victoria. On his family's property, it's a large block of scrubland bordered by native forest and eucalyptus plantations, with a single cabin in the center of the property. I won't post town names as it's too easy to find the property via Google Maps if I do, and the property is still used by his family semi-regularly. We didn't actually use the cabin at all, as we didn't have the keys for it at the time. Either way, it had no power and was never really used all that often, and we really wanted to camp out in a tent anyways. We had a kayaking trip planned for the following day, an hour or so away, so the 4x4 was towing one of those rental trailers stacked with like a few kayaks and canoes that you sometimes see outside of petrol stations with a big "Rent Me" sign on it. The ground around the cabin was way too rocky and compacted to pitch our tent, so we went out bush into a small clearing among the scrub where the ground was forgiving enough to get the tent going, as well as a small fire. We set up the tent, pick-related, and got the gear we needed inside the tent along with our sleeping stuff, etc., etc. The scrub is very thick, and after about 100 to 150 meters, all the trees kind of blend into one. It's hard to keep your focus on one thing, especially when the wind hits and the trees start to sway. The forest gets thicker at the back of the property as well, where it connects to more native forest. We had this day mostly free, as we got there relatively early and we didn't plan on leaving to go kayaking until lunchtime the following day. We had a few plans on what we wanted to do, most of which involved hiking and exploring. We first headed up an old motorbike quad trackway to the back of the property and hopped the really poorly maintained fence. It looked over 100 years old. The wire and stumps were rusted and rotted to shit, into the native forest on the other side. We followed the other fence line for some time until we came to an open field by a creek bed. The area had been used previously, but a long time ago by the looks of things, as there was lots of rusted farming and tree clearing equipment. The field was covered in tall grass, about 4 to 5 feet tall, which slowly got shorter and shorter the closer it got to the creek. While the creek was dry, it was certainly alive and had held water quite recently, as the soil was cool and almost but not quite damp. There were kangaroo footprints all over the creek bed and the banks nearby, so the area gets used often by fauna. We continued on, following the creek, and we soon realized that the creek is joined onto another larger creek, which connects to the dirt road that the entrance to the property is on, though a fair distance away now at this point. The road goes over the creek with a small, single-lane concrete bridge. This creek held a lot more water, but the water level was still quite low, and some areas of the creek didn't have very much water at all. There was enough water in some parts that there were probably some decent fish, though. We didn't stick around too long at the bridge and continued onwards. Some of the deeper portions were clear enough you could see small fish, tadpoles, etc. swimming about. We continued on to a point where the creek got quite rocky, and the water level was relatively shallow, almost like the creek bed was a series of rock pools by the sea. Scattered along the side of the creek bed and inside it were freshwater mussel shells. It seemed odd, to say the least. Some were very old and almost falling apart in the sun. Others were more fresh. Some were broken, as though they were smashed with a rock. Others like they were pried open. A 10-meter stretch of the creek was dotted with heaps and heaps of them. We checked out the surrounding area a little bit more, but in the moment thought very little of it. At first, I thought it might have been from fishermen, but the creek wasn't wide enough to cast even a child-sized fishing rod. We headed back the way we came, but this time on the other side of the creek, and came back to the bridge. We passed under the bridge, trying not to slip into the water. Looking on the side of the bank, we noticed some bones sticking out of the mud and sand. They were kangaroo bones as far as I could tell. It was as though it had been buried when the flow of the water was much stronger and higher. But it also seemed like it had been pushed into the bank, or placed there. The area under the bridge where we found it was relatively free of debris, so it seemed really out of place. Luckily, there was no smell though. We ended up retracing our steps after this and headed back to camp. We hung around for a few hours, had a really late lunch, and then started setting up a campfire before the sun sets. I myself had never camped in this area before, but one of the two friends I was with had, as his family owned the property. I was shit at making a campfire, so he did most of the work in that department. He had never camped here with so few people though. Most of the time when he camps here, it's with 2 to 3 families, and they have a party or something. This time it was just the 3 of us. I returned for one of the parties a year later. It was great fun, actually. The sun started to set and we sat around the fire and ate some shitty half-stale sandwiches and chatted quietly. We ended up crawling into the tent around midnight. I woke up startled around 1:30 a.m. I was barely able to see my watch face even with its backlight. I could hear something outside the tent. My friends weren't awake yet, so I decided not to wake them yet. I roll over onto my belly and prop myself up with my elbows and just listen. Whatever it was getting closer to the tent. I could hear its feet tread through the undergrowth and could hear its mass brushing up against the bracken fern as it approached. It gets close, I would say within 5 meters or so, and stops. I can hear it breathe or sniff the air or whatever. I couldn't quite tell. It sounded a little raspy, like a larger person does when they breathe. Slowly it moved closer to the tent and started to make its way around, anti-clockwise. It got so close to the tent, the cracking of sticks beneath its feet was almost deafening. This is when my friends started to wake up. They seemed as confused and afraid as I was. Whatever it was, it seemed to switch from moving on all fours to moving on two legs. When I realized that, I could barely move, let alone breathe. I was frozen with fear. Not one of us made a sound. Things got quiet for a bit. We whispered a few words to each other. This thing starts laughing. Well, it sounded like laughing. It was a deep, raspy sound, like it was coming from deep within the diaphragm. It would sometimes trail off into a howl or bark. It didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard. It was so terrifying I could barely think. It continued on for what felt like forever, before it moved back off the way it came from. It would stop and start, and make deep, whooping sounds when it was stopped, at 10 to 20-second intervals before moving off again, deeper into the forested area. Once it had reached a considerable distance, and we couldn't hear its movement, only its calls, we started to WTF pretty hard. We were all as silent as possible, but pretty obviously losing our shit. It continued to call for a while, repeating the same howl-like call over and over, until in the distance it got answered by another call. Whatever the fuck it was, there were two of them. We proceeded to shit our pants for the next 4 or 5 hours until the sun came up. Once whatever the fuck it was trailed off into the distance, we didn't hear anything for hours until the sun came up, but we were still scared shitless. We packed up the camp so quickly, and with very little sleep, left the property, and drove to the river where we were going to go kayaking. I had never felt so exhausted in my entire life. We spoke about it a little when we were kayaking on the river, but it had rattled us pretty bad, so conversation was fleeting at best. We never really discussed it properly until some weeks later, when I decided to look into it more deeply.
I've never seen one myself, but I've had some weird experiences out in the bush for sure. I used to live up in Mapleton on the sunny coast and was a keen camper. I grew up in Brisbane though, so was never really too experienced or confident enough to go too far off the beaten track, so it always felt safe to camp. Only thing I thought you needed to watch out for were snakes, and if you're careful, they stick to themselves anyway. But there's definitely something more living out there. You can feel its presence. You can find signs of them out there. It's almost like they leave signals out for themselves. When they're around the bush, it goes dead quiet, silent. And usually, the bush is so loud you almost need to raise your voice to talk. It's almost like every other animal either respects it enough to shut up or they all fuck off out of there. Have had enough experience out in the bush to know when something's not right, and there's no way you'd get me camping out in certain areas with lots of reported sightings. Signs of them include things like weird structures out there in the bush, going for hikes deep enough into the mountains where I was living, and you'll definitely find stick structures shoved a good 30 centimeters into the ground. No way they could be shoved that deep into hard ground by just falling or the wind. I also think it's just impossible to rule out the possibility of their existence entirely. So much bushland in Australia is just totally vast and dense and almost incapable of being truly explored. I reckon they're out there for sure.
Beamy, 19. Mid-1990s near Rossville, far north Queensland, out pig hunting with mate and his older brother, few months before Port Arthur, so we all have Chingmaid SKS. We drive out about 8 kilometers south of Black Mountain, where large pigs have been spotted. Black Mountain is a giant pile of rocks, located in the middle of nowhere. The Aboriginals don't go near it, and most people who have climbed it have either died or been so traumatized they can't properly recall what they experienced. We set up camp about 5 minutes from the highway. Stag chili beans with damper and tuis for dinner. We all go to out in our sleeping bags. It was summer, so we just slept in the open with some mozzie coils burning. Sudden snapping noise in the dark wakes us all up. Hear shuffling. Remain perfectly still. If it's a pig, it might become startled and charge us. All 3 of us very slowly reach for our rifles. Zip on my rifle bag opening and the dark sounds as loud as the THX screen. Shuffling stops. Realize there are no insects chirping. Getting freaked out. Suddenly, a small rock lands on my chest. A small silhouette of a person appears at the edge of the clearing we're lying in. I sit up quickly, awkwardly pulling out my rifle. Fucking cheap piece of shit SKS gets stuck in the half-open zipper. I end up shouldering the whole bag and trying to cock the rifle from inside. My mate and his brother are both scrambling out of their sleeping bags, yelling out and getting out their rifles too. The small person gets startled and rushes into the darkness of the tree line again. "What the hell was that?" Mate shouts, turning on torch and shining it into the direction of the little person. I say probably some aboriginal screwing around with us. We take turns sleeping for the rest of the night. In the morning, me and Mate go in the direction the person ran last night, trying to find tracks. Nothing. "Come on, let's go!" Mate's brother shouts. I autistically stop to pick up my sleeping bag and rifle bag as I go past it. We get into the truck, floor it. Something smacks into the windscreen as we leave the clearing. Probably a rock, though I never got to see it. Mate's brother skids wildly on gravel. We end up in a ditch. Wheels spinning. Palms are sweaty. Piss running down my legs already. Chased by Yeti. Mate fires randomly out of the passenger window right in front of my face. Ears ringing. Vision is fucked from muzzle flash. I think I'm swearing at him, but I can't hear my own voice due just being ear-raped by the People's Republic of China. Amidst the ringing in my ears, I hear Mate's brother distantly screaming, "Anon, get out!" I get out of the ute, squinting as I try to see into the dark. I run after Mate and his brother. They run through tree line on some old horse trail. "Where are we going, dude?" I shout. If they answered, I couldn't hear them. Exit tree line. Recognize the same creek from earlier, just further down, heart pounding, hearing and eyesight starting to return. The fluttering sound is everywhere. I feel something behind me as a shudder goes down my spine. I turn, a rancid burning smell entering my nostrils. Thick matted brown fur is right in front of my face. Whatever the creature is, it was huge. I look up at its face. It leans down and puts its face next to mine. The stench is overpowering. Vomit in my mouth a little, but too terrified to move. I black out. Wake up in Cooktown Hospital. Apparently I'd been missing for days, and an SCS search team had gone out to find me. Mom asks what happened. I was camping near Black Mountain. Mom goes quiet. "Anon, don't go camping near Black Mountain." We never spoke of it again.
I live in Australia. The Yowie is widely dismissed as a myth, but I've got several stories. They all stem from when I lived in a national park in Western Australia close to the Helena River. The park ran all the way out towards Brookton and was absolutely massive. It contains both the Helena Valley Pump Station Dam and the Mundering Weir. This is important as all of my experiences have been in summer, and I believe it's because a lot of the smaller sources of water dry up, leaving only the dams as a dependent source over the summer. The area is taboo to Indigenous Australians as it's believed to belong to something else. This was documented as early as when Captain Stirling first settled the state. The native people would follow the Europeans up the Swan River observing them until they continued up into the Helena River, where they would cease following them and watch as they disappeared up the creek. My stories range from around 1997 when I first moved into our home through to 2014 when I moved interstate. I typed this in advance and will dump it all now. 1. When I first moved into the home, I was only young, about 7 years old. My earliest memories of something strange happening were soft, heavy footsteps of something moving outside. I don't remember the year exactly, but at night I would often hear these steps and things shuffle quietly outside. My dad was renovating the very old house and stored stuff on the veranda outside my bedroom window too. The first time I realized something was in the park around the home was in 2003 when I was exploring it at night with my friends. We were disturbed by something very large that chased us. Our group was split up, and the ones that came later were entirely pale, claiming that something screamed out of the bush at them and chased them back to my house, never leaving the bush. In the morning, we went back to look and saw broken tree limbs and foliage in a line parallel to the trail they were running along in the area they described it happened. 3. In around 2010, a friend and I were hunting rabbits at the Helena Dam at night. We were watching a group of kangaroos drinking in the middle of the dried-up river. Only a small portion of the dam still contained water. The river had almost completely dried up. Something disturbed them, not us. We were still and watching from a distance, and they left in a hurry. We walked to where they were, and we heard a grunt. Then something massive sprinted along the dried-up riverbed in the thick bush for about 100 meters and stopped. It took maybe 5 seconds for it to cover that distance. We stopped and listened for a few minutes, hoping to see what it was with the light. We could hear the occasional sound of the bush being disturbed in that general area and decided to leave out of fear. About 400 meters from the road where the car was, we heard a huge grunt and flicked the spotlight on towards the sound. It sounded only meters away. We couldn't see anything and agreed to run, making it back to the car. We agreed to return in the morning, and with my then girlfriend along, we went to where the kangaroos were. About 50 meters away along the bank where we heard the running, we found a primitive shelter made of tree limbs and brush. The inside had a crude nest of leaves and grass. There was a modest opening on both sides of the dome-shaped shelter. 4. The last story, and the one that made me think it was all related to the Yowie. One night we had a few friends over and 2 guys and a girl, told us that as they were leaving the last time after midnight, they saw a silhouette about 7 to 8 feet tall sprint across our carport, maybe 15 meters across, and into the bush in only a few strides with no sound as it ran. It was covered in fur of a pale color, and they just leaped into the car and took off. I called bullshit and offered them 50 if one crossed my carport on their own and touched my shed door in the dark. They all refused and said nothing would make them go out alone. That was the last thing that happened to me there. I've been back since for a look around and never seen anything, but I firmly believe that there's Yowie out there.
Did the Australian government wipe out or relocate Yowies? Up until the 90s, Yowies were seen frequently. A bloke near my place got attacked while climbing a hill. People would see them trashing parks and construction sites near forests. You'd hear tales of being followed in the night while hiking and hearing howls in the hills. Now there's nothing. You will very occasionally hear something that sounds like an inhuman screaming howl in the mountains, and I have seen one personally by a river, but these are very infrequent and isolated incidents. I personally believe the government ran a secret campaign against Yowies in the 90s. It must have been a nationwide military exercise. My best guess would be that it took place during the same time as the 1999 East Timor conflict, which would allow troops more freely to move without anybody noticing something is up. Please post any Yowie stories you have below. I am fascinated by these cryptids, and I know from personal experience they exist, which is both amazing and honestly terrifying. I'd love to know more.
They moved further north as our territory encroached on theirs. Our military isn't smart enough to perform population control on them, and it was raised the aggression levels after that, which hasn't been recorded in modern sightings. They just want to be left alone.
The USA actually has a very sophisticated working group which tracks them and manages their population. They use domestic intelligence resources and special forces to hunt and kill problem individuals, leaving the majority free to roam as long as they remain secretive. Sasquatch are very stealthy and have huge natural advantages over us in wild environments, so not being seen is a choice. Whatever this agency is called, it violently persuades them to choose correctly. I would assume that AU has a similar agency. Given our intelligence ties, we probably collaborated with your government, sharing expertise in things like satellite resources to help you do the same. Keep them in wild areas away from human habitation if they start generating rumors and police calls. Jevning has a very large network of researchers as well as intelligence contacts, and he makes this clear. If you read between the lines in the missing 411 books, many of Meldrum's case reports corroborate this picture. Meldrum believes they're interdimensional fairy people, of course, but he's a midwit, so of course he does. People would rather believe in teleporting forest brothers who live in hyperspace than believe a relic hominid is way better at outdoorsmanship than they can even imagine being.
I've also seen obvious supernatural things in the woods, but all the evidence points to Sasquatch being a brutally material creature that's just highly adapted to living in wild environments and keeping clear of us, for the most part. The thing to keep in mind is that these things didn't suddenly appear in 1967 when Patterson and Gimlin made their film. They've been around as long as we have, and our respective species have shaped each other's evolution. They're mostly nocturnal. We're diurnal. They live in mountains and forests. We live in cleared valleys and floodplains. We occupy separate ecological niches for a reason. All the ancient legends of these things, trolls, wild men, giants, don't ascribe them supernatural powers other than great strength and ugliness. They're just monsters.
The population probably dwindled since other creatures already have their territories.
Their populations are actually rising in North America. Far fewer people are rural, and industrial farming has increased their food supply. Directly and indirectly, deer are overpopulated now, and those are their primary prey. Except for humans, they are the apex predator on this planet, so nothing else can really exclude them from territory they want to occupy. They're also incredibly migratory, so they don't really have territories the way other animals do. Jevning and his group have tracked a few populations and found that troops can travel as much as 400 miles in a year. They also rotate feeding grounds, typically only coming back to hunt an area every 3 years. If cougars, coyotes, or wolves happen to be hunting that zone too, tough shit for them. They move out or become prey themselves.
They are real. Thousands upon thousands of eyewitness reports with details like sagittal crest, snowshoeing type gait with little to no head bounce, pungent smells, large rocks being thrown their direction, etc. Alleged tracks often display evidence of a mid-tarsal break, which, 1, is harder to hoax, and 2, would be an unknown concept to the majority of educated people, let alone rural pre-internet folk. Plenty of plausible videos/images to review, although they usually lack official names. Dozens of tribes across the Americas have described Bigfoot in both the context of witnesses but also in the context of folklore going back many, many centuries. Different names for this very similarly described creature include Sasquatch, Skookum, Skunk Ape, Didi, Sisimite, Mapinguari, Sabe, Bagwaji-Winag, UCU, Nukluk, Yeti, Yuren, Yowie, Olmas. I know I personally find it a cop-out when people say do your own research, but after a couple hours of research, I believe.
I hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. If you enjoyed tonight's story, then please subscribe to the channel, as more Greentext will appear daily. A new broadcast will appear when the clock strikes midnight Central Time.